So hi and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Introduction to the Middle Way, both for all of you present and I think a much larger group that's going to be listening to the recordings. I guess I'm going to start just by thanking you all for joining and remarking that it's very auspicious. There are so many of us interested in these teachings. Over 1,450 signed up from over 54 different nationalities. I was thinking, it's a lovely summer's evening, as Rinpoche would often say. There's so many other things we could be doing with our time, and yet here we are listening to this very dry academic teaching. So, yeah, and even more so for those of you who are in other parts of the world listening in the early morning or the middle of the night. So I just want to say thank you, and I take it as very auspicious that you're all here. Just a couple of notes of administration. It is possible to type questions, as some of you are already doing. Since there are so many of you, I'm not sure how many I'm going to be able to answer during the webinar itself, but please feel free to ask them here, or even better, on the website for the program. And that's the second thing I would say. The website, which is madhyamaka.com, that will be our primary communication tool for the next 8 weeks. So please, I encourage you all, if you haven't already taken a look, I'll be putting up recordings, downloads, lots of readings, and there'll also be opportunity to ask questions, and we'll have discussion groups. So please, please use it, and please give me feedback. Please let me know what works, what doesn't work, what else you'd like to see. So I should say, the reason I'm here, if I've got anything to offer to you, it's because of Rinpoche. So I want to start by thanking Rinpoche, both for making this opportunity available and for having taught me these teachings 3 times. I've received it from him 3 4-year cycles in France, San Francisco, and in Australia. So if I know and I'm able to pass on anything to you, it's because of him. So thank you, Rinpoche. It's kind of awkward to prostrate to my teacher when I'm plugged into this headset, but if you can visualize me doing it, I shall visualize myself doing it. I'd also like to offer homage to the teaching itself. This is an amazing teaching, one of the greatest of the Mahayana teachings. And we've got very little time, frankly, to go through what is a very large text. Rinpoche taught it over 4 years, and he said that even that was very much kind of rushing through it compared to the pace that it was taught in the Shedras. And at the same time, I acknowledge that it's foundational, it's really important, and not all of us have the time to take out 4 years to study this. So I very much wanted to offer something that was condensed and hopefully accessible. And if there's interest, we can always go deeper, both with Q&A on the website and also subsequently with deeper study. Thank you all also for those of you who filled in the survey. Perhaps unsurprisingly, one of the main things that many of you feel is that the Madhyamaka can be very difficult, very academic, very unrelated to everyday life, which it can be troubling for us because we hear it's the foundation of our path and our practice, and yet if it's something that seems too distant or too difficult, how are we supposed to practice it? So I very much want to offer something that is accessible, is practical, and is relevant. So we will be going through for the middle weeks of this program, the text, the logic, the argument, but the last 2 weeks will very much focus on practice and on how to apply these teachings in everyday life. Now, it'll be accessible, hopefully practical. I'm not sure it'll be easy though, and it's not so much that the teachings themselves are difficult, it's more, as Rinpoche often says, that they go against our habits. And we have a deep habit of clinging to the self and to the phenomena around us. And so when we study these teachings which tell us that all these phenomena, the self itself, has no substantial reality, it can be difficult to accept. Rinpoche often tells a story of a child playing on a sandy beach, building a sandcastle, and completely engaged in building this beautiful sandcastle. And then the tide starts coming in, and the child becomes increasingly upset as the waters start to erode and then totally destroy his sandcastle. Now, of course, if we're the parent of that child, we might see the whole situation very, very differently. We might see it as a wonderful day at the beach where we get to build sandcastles with our child, knowing and enjoying the moment, knowing full well that it's going to pass, that it is impermanent. But for that child, that's not his or her experience. Now, likewise, Rinpoche says, maybe it was a little later in our lives, we become teenagers, and maybe we like skateboards, right? So by that stage, what's interesting is we've renounced our interest in the sandcastle. Now, what matters is the skateboard. And then a little later, we become adults. It's all about our houses, our careers. Later still, we become close to retirement. And Rinpoche says, then we're concerned about lace tablecloths and salt shakers. Sounds a little bit like an English country house to me, but I think that the point there is renunciation, there's a certain kind or a certain level of renunciation that happens naturally just as we grow old, just as we go through our lives. And we can look back on our earlier lives and we can think of all the things that were our sort of childish attachments and realize, how we got caught up at the time, but for us now it doesn't really have any effect. We can see, their insubstantiality. We can see their impermanence. We can see that the sandcastle we're building, it doesn't have a true substantial self or reality, and we don't get attached to it, right? And this, I would say, is perhaps a rational way of thinking about the view. We know at some rational level that the self isn't really there. And as in our sober moments, we're able to watch our emotions, to manage our reactions. But for most of us, from time to time, we'll still get upset. Just as the child gets upset if the sandcastle is lost. If we lose something important to us, we break something important to us, we can still become upset. So even though it may be rational, it doesn't mean it's easy to practice. But what we're going to look at here is something even more than that. And this is the view of non-duality. And it goes beyond what's merely rational to something more paradoxical, perhaps a little stranger. I want to give you a couple of quotes just to set the tone. So first from the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness. Emptiness also is form. Emptiness is no other than form. Form is no other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness are emptiness. Thus, Shariputra, all dhammas are emptiness. There are no characteristics. There is no birth and no cessation. There is no impurity and no purity. There is no decrease and no increase. So already when you hear that, you're probably thinking, it's a little strange. What does it mean to say there's no impurity and no purity? No birth, no cessation? That doesn't fit with our everyday experiences at all. Another example, this is a story from the Mumonkan, the Gateless Gate, a collection of Zen stories. This is one called Shuzan's Short Staff. So Shuzan held out his short staff, and he said, if you call this a short staff, you oppose its reality. If you do not call it a short staff, you ignore the fact. Now, what do you wish to call this? The final example is one from the Bertram Sutra, Diamond Sutra, from section 21. Subhuti, do not think that the Tathagata holds the thought, I have something to teach. Do not even think such a thing. Why not? Whoever says that the Tathagata has a Dharma to teach slanders the Buddha, because he does not understand my teaching, Subhuti. In teaching the Dharma, there is no Dharma to teach. This is called teaching the Dharma. Yeah, so how are we supposed to understand these things? It seems like paradox, nonsense, maybe irrationality. And yet somehow there's a resonance. We know they're getting at something important. And yes, perhaps it's easy to assume it's just poetic or expressive. But I hope by the end of our 8 weeks, you'll be able to understand what's actually going on in these quotes. And see there's actually something much more there. One other story, also from the Zen tradition. It's called A Cup of Tea. Many of you may know this one. So Nan-in, who was a Japanese Zen master in the Meiji era, received a university professor who came to inquire about Zen. Nan-in served tea. He poured his visitor's cup full, and then kept on pouring. The professor watched the overflow until he could no longer restrain himself. It is overfull. No more will go in. Like this cup, Nan-in said, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup? So this is the famous beginner's mind. And of course it's our aspiration when studying Madhyamaka to approach it with that same mind. Now, as I mentioned before, this is hard. I mean, it's going to challenge our views. And we'll realize that even though we may not be university professors, our cups are already full, right? Especially when it comes to the view of self. So one thing that I think will be, I'd really encourage you over the next few weeks as you engage in this series of teachings, is really to notice, when do you find it challenging? When do you find that you disagree strongly? When do you find it provokes you? Or possibly even when do you find that you're bored or tired and you simply just can't engage? Because as Freud said, even boredom can be a sign that you're getting defensive about something. But more generally, what kind of motivation should we bring as we listen to these teachings? So yes, we should begin ideally with an empty cup. But in the tradition, for example, in the Words of My Perfect Teacher, we talk of 3 different levels of motivation. And the lowest is if we engage in the teachings just out of fear of suffering or desire for happiness. The middle level is seeking Nirvana for ourselves. And the highest aspiration is seeking perfect enlightenment for all sentient beings. So I'd like to encourage you to listen with that highest motivation, if you can, even if it may only feel intellectual at this stage. But I guess at very least, I'd encourage you to try not to approach these teachings with a narrow academic mindset. As Rinpoche would often say, look, if, this is not to write a PhD, this is not to be able to better debate or argue. This is so we can apply it in our own practice and in our own path. And also, as Rinpoche said, when we're going to encounter a lot of arguments, a lot of different opponents from Buddhist and non-Buddhist philosophical schools. And while, these schools were around many hundreds or thousands of years ago, we might think they represent something that's ancient and even irrelevant to us. But as Rinpoche said, try instead to engage with them as if what they're saying is a mindset that you can find alive and well in your own thoughts. Start to notice how sometimes you will adopt views that sound an awful lot like some of our opponents. Yeah, because if you can apply it in your own life to yourself, perhaps there'll be something more at stake for you. I think that'll help. Now, one other thing you may have noticed if you've looked at the website is for our 8 weeks, I've used the images from the 10 ox herding pictures, originally also a Zen tradition. And I like them not just for the images and the poems. Actually, I have a very personal connection with them because before I met Rinpoche, before I even met any living teacher of the Dharma, that was one of the first things that I read as a teenager. And so it's a special place in my own heart. I planted a seed there that led me to the Dharma. And the 10th ox herding picture ends very beautifully with the sage in the marketplace, which is very much where we're going to end, taking our view and looking at how we can apply it in our everyday life, in our work, in our relationships. But how does the story begin? So I'd just like to read you the text of the first of the 10 poems. This one's called The Search for the Bull. In the pasture of this world, I endlessly push aside the tall grasses in search of the bull. Following unnamed rivers, lost upon the interpenetrating paths of distant mountains, my strength failing and my vitality exhausted, I cannot find the bull. I only hear the locusts churring through the forest at night. And if you know this, you'll know there's a commentary from Mumon. And here he says, the bull never has been lost. What need is there to search? Only because of separation from my true nature, I fail to find him. In the confusion of the senses, I lose even his tracks. Far from home, I see many crossroads, but which way is the right one, I know not. Greed and fear, good and bad, entangle me. So yes, that's probably a very familiar experience for many of us, right? Such is the struggle of samsara. We're searching for the truth, our true nature. And trying to understand, what is it that drives us to do all that we do, that keeps us bound in samsara? And what do we have to realize to find liberation for ourselves and for all others? So this whole question of, what does it mean? How do we go about finding the truth? And this, I think, takes us into the whole subject of philosophy. And I'd like to say a few words about philosophy in general before we talk about philosophy in the Buddhist tradition. Because a lot of what the Madhyamaka covers is questions of, what is true, what is reality, and then, of course, applying that to how should we live. So I think the understanding is, if you're trying to follow a way of living that's based on something that's untrue or unreal, eventually you're going to get into trouble. For those of you who read the George Orwell pre-reading, I think he makes that point very beautifully. So in philosophy, this notion of what is truth is called epistemology. It's the study of knowledge, justification, rationality of belief. And the Western and the Buddhist traditions of knowledge are somewhat different. In Indian and Buddhist philosophy, the tradition is called pramana, which means valid cognition. And we will be touching on it in more depth as we go through some of the debate. And certainly understanding, particularly some of the great Buddhist epistemologists, Dignaga Dhammakirti, what did they say and how were they interpreted by subsequent commentators? I mean, some of these interpretations of the basic epistemology that actually led to a lot of the differences between the Madhyamaka schools, both in India, where the Prasangika and Svatantrika divided, and then subsequently when the Madhyamaka went to Tibet, with the four schools taking different positions on how to interpret Dhammakirti, for example. So there's a big historical element, which we'll understand here. And then also later on, we'll come to a conversation about the two truths. And again, epistemology will be at the core of that conversation. You know, in Buddhism, we accept generally perception and inference as what is valid. But then when are our perceptions valid and when are they invalid? You know, when can we trust what we see? When can we trust what we think? So a lot of what we're going to touch on is that. And I want to just say a little about how the Buddhist and the Western philosophical traditions actually have a lot in common. If you have a chance, one of the pre-readings I suggested is Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. It's a wonderful book. And he, in his introduction, talks about, I guess, two major different ways of thinking about truth or knowledge in the Western tradition, at least. So first we have definite knowledge, which I guess in Buddhist tradition we call valid cognition. And in the West, that's science. When we have good evidence, we have facts, we can see that something is there because we can test it. And then on the other extreme, we have dogma about what's beyond definite knowledge. And traditionally, this has been the domain of religion, which does not function with evidence. And people often ask the question, well, is Buddhism a religion? Is it a philosophy? Where does it stand? Or some even nowadays would say, is it a science? So for those of you who read the Donald Lopez pre-reading, I think there's an interesting question there. How much should Buddhism be thought of in scientific terms? But Bertram Russell, he says, between science and between dogma, there's actually a gray zone, a very big no man's land, where science cannot offer us answers, and where, in his words, the confident answers of theologians no longer seem so convincing. And he lists many classic philosophical questions. One of the ones I think is relevant to us is there a way of living that is noble and another that is base? Or are all ways of living merely futile? And if there is a way of living that is noble, in what does it consist? How shall we achieve it? Also, for example, must the good be eternal in order to deserve to be valued? Or is it worth seeking even if the universe is inexorably moving towards death? Is there such a thing as wisdom? Or is what seems such merely the ultimate refinement of folly? So, these are classical questions. And even, another one I love is Socrates, who used to ask, what is the good for the city and the man? As Buddhists, we also ask ourselves these questions, right? We want to do what is good. The Eightfold Path is called noble, right? It's the path for the noble ones. So just as the ancient Greeks, we wish to try and live on the side of noble rather than ignoble. Likewise, as Mahayana Buddhists, our aspiration is that of bodhicitta. We want both relative and ultimate benefit for all beings. But what is good? How do we know? And when we think about the noble path, which we've been taught, how do we know that it's right? So, in Buddhism, we don't want to get into general philosophical speculation or metaphysics. Right, again, the Buddha famously had this discussion with Malunkyaputta, who asked 10 questions on metaphysics, like, is the universe eternal or not? Finite or infinite? Is the soul the same as the body or separate? Does the Tathagata exist after death or not? Both or neither? And here the Buddha said, he told a story of a man wounded by a poisoned arrow, just to say, look, I don't want to speculate. I don't want to take time on questions like this. He said, suppose, Malunkyaputta, a man is wounded by a poisoned arrow, and his friends and relatives bring him to a surgeon. Suppose the man should then say, I will not let this arrow be taken out until I know who shot me, whether he is a warrior or a Brahman or a trader, or a Sudra of the low caste, what his name and family may be, whether he is tall or short, or medium stature, whether his complexion is black or golden or brown, or from which village he comes. I will not let this arrow be taken out until I know the bow with which it was shot, and so on. And the Buddha said, that man would die without knowing any of these things. So, yeah, it's really important when we think about philosophy to stay very focused on what are the kinds of questions that are going to lead us to liberation, rather than just general speculation. And in Buddhism, we know what we're interested in. I mean, go back to the Four Noble Truths. Suffering, the origin of suffering, cessation, and then the path. But in particular, the second truth, the origin of suffering. We know it's craving, but what is that craving based upon? Now, we know it's self, we know it's self-clinging, but do we really understand that, right? That's going to be the core of our investigation. And what we're going to arrive at is the conclusion that self-clinging is based on a false view of self. It's not about denying self. It's not about having a real self that we somehow have to punish, like the ancient Hindu ascetics did, but rather that it's just a mistake. One other thing I want to say is, when he said, look, why should we study the Madhyamaka? He said it's really important also to have guardrails for our practice. So a couple of reasons. I mean, firstly, it's great to have devotion, to have inspiration, and we should always aim to be inspired by our practice. But as Rinpoche says, emotions are fickle, right? We may feel great one day, but then maybe after a few weeks, we don't feel like practicing anymore. We lose our inspiration. So at times like that, we need something to allow us to stay the course, right? We need some guardrails. We need the view. And also, as Rinpoche said, the Dharma now, the early stages of introduction of Dharma into the modern world, into the West, they're now over, right? The Dharma is in a very different, a very complex environment. There's many different schools all being taught simultaneously in the West. And at the same time, Dharma is encountering Western psychology and self-help, all kinds of New Age theories. And even within the West now, people are reinterpreting what is secular Buddhism. Do we need to update Buddhism for the modern world? And Rinpoche says again, it's very difficult to know what should we trust, right? How will we know what is an authentic path? Right? So for all of this, we need view. So now let's talk a little about the view. As I said, I wanted in this first session to talk about what is the view and why is it so important. Well, what is a view, first of all? A view is basically a way of seeing the world, a story, a mindset, a set of assumptions, a perspective perhaps, maybe a theory, maybe a story we tell. I'll use a couple of classic examples. The snake versus the rope, right? We might see a striped rope lying on the floor, but we might not know it. Maybe the room is dark, maybe it's dim, maybe we're a little afraid, and we might misinterpret it, right? Our view might be that this thing, which is in reality a rope, we misinterpret as being a snake. And so because of our mistaken view, we react, we become emotional. Perhaps we run out of the room screaming. And then only later, when we turn on the light, do we see that actually we were mistaken. Right? So that's an example, right? A view then, in this case, the view that the snake is there when in fact it's actually a rope, leads to our behavior, right? So our view, our mindsets lead to our behavior. Another example, one that Rinpoche often uses, is the idea of, people who are wondering what does it mean to look beautiful. Right? So maybe they read a magazine on beauty, maybe they read Vogue, and they spend time studying and contemplating all the articles, all the images, right? Until they have some kind of view now established in their mind about what does it mean to be beautiful. And then they engage in all the actions, which would make them look like their vision of what is beauty. Right, so again, the way it works, the way everything works, is that we start with a view, whether or not we know it, we have one. We have views, and our actions come from our views. I mean, even in Western psychology, this idea is very familiar. I mean, most of the cognitive approach to psychology is based on this. I mean, even Freud, when he talked about the iceberg, he would say, you can think of a person like an iceberg, where you see a little bit on the surface, which is the parts we actually see, our behaviors, but there's an awful lot going on the inside, both that we're conscious of and that we're unconscious of. So, I checked the dictionary definition. It said a particular way of considering or regarding something, an attitude or an opinion, a point of view, a viewpoint, a belief, a judgment, a notion, an idea, a conviction. Right, so there are many views we have in the relative world, like the examples of the snake and the rope, perhaps like examples of beauty. But as Buddhists, the view that we're really concerned about is the view of self. Because as we said a moment ago, that is the root of samsara. Because we have a view that our self is real, it's somehow true, it's somehow the most important point of reference in our lives, we then construct the notions of me, of mine, of subjectivity and objectivity, and we then get caught up in the 12 links of interdependent origination, in hope, in fear, and then we suffer. Right, so the view, in this case the view of ignorance, the idea of thinking that there is a self, it drives everything else and ultimately our actions. And ultimately, according to the tradition, it also then drives our rebirth in samsara. So this is what we have to uproot. At a more relative level, and Rinpoche often uses this example of saying, well, how do we know if we're actually making progress in our realization of the view? He talks about the 8 worldly dharmas, the 8 samsaric dharmas. And these are hope for happiness, fear of suffering, hope for fame, fear of insignificance, hope for praise, fear of blame, hope for gain, fear of loss. Right, so basically attachment and aversion. But he's saying for most of us, right now, those extremes feel very far apart from one another. Yeah, we really run for happiness and away from suffering. We really hope for gain and run from loss. And to the extent that we can start to, as Rinpoche says, equalize those, that is a sign that our view is becoming more embodied, more internalized. Now that's the most foundational view, which we would find in all the Buddhist schools, and in the Theravada as well. But in the Madhyamaka, we go beyond just the view of the self of the person, but also any other views, any views we have about phenomena. Right? So again, back to views about what does beauty mean? What does success mean? Right? What does it mean to do many of the things we do in life? Right? We have lots of views around that. And we want to understand, we want to show, and we will show, that all of these views of phenomena are likewise without essence, right? Without a foundation. Now, that's not to say they're not very real for us. It's not to say they don't drive us, but just to say they're not substantial. And if you ask yourself, well, where do I learn these things? Where did I learn my idea of beauty? Where did I learn my idea of what it is to be successful in life? Where did I learn what it is to be a good friend, or a good parent, or a good son? And for many of us, these views come from places we've never thought about, really, from our family, from our childhood, from our education, from our society, from our friends on Facebook, perhaps. we don't necessarily analyze them. We don't even necessarily know we have these views, right? But nevertheless, they're affecting us. I want to offer another quote from Bertram Russell. He said, ever since men became capable of free speculation, their actions in innumerable important respects have depended upon their theories as to the world and human life, as to what is good and what is evil. And this is as true in the present day as at any former time. To understand an age or a nation, we must understand its philosophy. And to understand its philosophy, we must ourselves be in some degree philosophers. There is here a reciprocal causation. The circumstances of men's lives do much to determine their philosophy, but conversely, their philosophy does much to determine their circumstances. So, a lot of what we're going to be examining then is, understanding where our views come from and learning to hold our views more lightly, right? Learning to see that they're not as solid as we thought. Back to the child with the sandcastle. Maybe the child holds onto the sandcastle with a very solid view about what he or she wants to build and how it must look. But by the time we're adults, we've learned to let go of that a little. And also to understand a little bit about where are our views distorted, where are our views in error, where are our maps of the world not complete. I always like looking at medieval maps, from the early days of exploration, 15th, 16th centuries. And you'll often see a map where in a corner the map maker, the explorer, isn't quite sure what's going on there and has written, here be dragons. Actually, in ancient Rome, they had the same thing with the Roman map makers, except there they wrote, here be lions. But the idea, I love the idea, right? This idea that when we're confronting something that we're not sure about, when we don't really understand what's going on, we'll often be afraid, right? We'll often just panic and think of the worst. So, something similar. Okay, so relationship of view and practice. So, Roche often talks about view, meditation, and action or conduct, and how these three are all related. And yes, as we've seen, our view does determine our action. Although, as Rinpoche says, for some of us, it also works the other way around, right? As we engage in practice, we may not necessarily start with the view, but through our practice, we'll start to have insights about the nature of phenomena, the nature of ourselves, and then our practice can lead us to our view. But you may know that in Tibetan Buddhism, the word for practice or meditation is gom, and that actually means something like familiarization. So what does that mean? How can we understand that? I think for this, I'd like to introduce a term, a distinction introduced by actually a Harvard professor, Chris Jarvis, used to teach in the business school, and he differentiated between what we believe, right, what he called our espoused theory, and then what is actually driving our actions, and what he called our theory in use. So let's take an example. So we might, for example, say, I know smoking is bad. I think people shouldn't smoke. I think I shouldn't smoke. So that might be my espoused theory. But nevertheless, I might still smoke, right? So my actual behaviors are inconsistent with my espoused theory. Right? My theory in use and my espoused theory don't match. So there's two different views we're talking about here, right? There's a view which we're aspiring to get towards, to realize, and then there's a view which is currently driving what we do. And the same is true in Buddhism, right? The path, practice, is all about closing that gap between the view we're going to establish and our our current view that's driving our current actions. And so in the tradition, we talk first about establishing the view, right? So in Nigeris' language, that's coming up with an espoused theory. In this case, the view is non-duality, the emptiness of the self, of the person and the self of phenomena. But for most of us, even after we've spent 8 weeks establishing the view and convincing ourselves that it is true, that it is right, that what our masters have told us makes sense, we then still have to practice, right? We have to work with that view until it is embodied, until it is the theory that's actually driving our day-to-day behaviors. Again, in modern Western psychology, we've discovered this notion of 10,000 hours of practice, right? That's what it takes to achieve mastery, to really completely internalize and achieve mastery over a different view or body of practice. And again, the important distinction there is, for example, if you want to become a good tennis player or a good chess player or a good musician, if you look at the elites in all of these different endeavors, they all spend a lot of time, but the essential thing is deliberate practice. It's the term that's used. And deliberate means we're not just sitting around in the tennis court and knocking a ball back and forth. We're actually being very thoughtful about working on our backhand or working on our forehand, right? Practicing the correct technique, right? Practicing the correct view of how we wish to serve or hit the ball. Because it's not practice that makes perfect, it's perfect practice that makes perfect. Right, so again, when it comes to our Buddhist practice, the same is true. It's important for us to try, if we can, to base our practice on the view. Because if we're just practicing without the view, then it's like a tennis player who's just knocking the ball around the court. And it's going to be difficult to actually really master our game. And yeah, I'd encourage us all, actually, is another thing you may wish to contemplate as you think about your current practice, as you think about your current actions or behaviors in the world, and when you think, what drives what I do, what drives the way I think about my practice, how am I approaching it, what is my view in reality, and what is my theory in use, and how different is that from this view of emptiness? And really, with every practice, whether it's taking refuge, practicing bodhicitta, nindro, mindfulness, vajrayana practices, all of these, in some way, we need to base on a view of emptiness. Okay, so that's, view in general, right? So why is the view important? Because our view drives our action. And ultimately, we're not going to change our actions unless we change our view. So the view drives everything, as Rinpoche says. It's the foundation. And in other words, he'll say another way of talking about attaining enlightenment is realizing the view. So to put it differently, it's when that gap between our espoused theory and our theory in use, there is no more any gap, right? Our view is now completely realized, completely internalized. And that is, in practical terms, another way of talking about what is enlightenment. So this view we're going to talk about for the next 8 weeks, it's very relevant, directly relevant to enlightenment itself. And the good news is, it's not as though we have to be like a surgeon learning all the details of anatomy or a lawyer learning all the details of the law. There really is only one thing we need to understand, which is this view of emptiness or non-duality, the view of the middle way. But of course, although it sounds very simple, it's actually the hardest thing because it goes so much against our habits, against society's habits. And if you've read Rinpoche's first book, what makes you not a Buddhist, he actually sets out the view there in the context of the Four Seals, which is the Mahayana version of the three marks of existence, of dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness, anicca, impermanence, and anatta, no self. And and then with the fourth seal added of nirvana, as in nirvana as beyond duality. So that's the simplest expression, right? And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the part of that that says non-self. Right? What does that mean? How do we understand that? In terms of how this fits into the Buddha's cycles of teachings, you may be familiar with the idea that the Buddha taught three turnings of the wheel of the Dharma. The first turning he taught at Deer Park. The audience was the Shravakas, and he taught the Four Noble Truths and the rest of the Tripitaka. The second turning, Vulture Peak Mountain, and mixed audience of bodhisattvas and arhats, that's where he taught emptiness. So this is a second turning teaching, the Prajnaparamita, the Heart Sutra, and then all the work of Nagarjuna and the rest of the Madhyamika tradition. And then after there was a third turning, we taught at Travasti and in other places, which was the teachings on Buddha nature, associated with the tradition of Maitreya. Now, one other thing we are going to also come across in the weeks ahead is how to understand which of these turnings is the definitive teaching of the Buddha and which is just provisional. Because, for example, Rinpoche says, in some of his teachings, Rinpoche will say things like, in one of my past lives when I was an animal, right, and he'd use that to tell a story, indicating that, there really was a true self in his past life. And that would be considered a provisional teaching, because in the second turning we learn that the self does not truly exist. Now, the debate comes between the second and the third turnings, which is like how to understand the relationship between emptiness and Buddha nature. As we saw with that quote from the beginning from the Vajracchedika Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, even there the Buddha says, there is no Buddha. So how are we to understand all of these teachings? And in particular, very important because, as Rinpoche has often said, if we misunderstand the Buddha nature teachings, it's very easy for us to slip into a view that is much like the Hindu view of some kind of universal self or universal cosmic spirit or soul or consciousness, right, which is very much like Atman. And that's actually one of our opponents, right, which we sought to defeat. So we'll see a little bit about how the different schools understand these three turnings in different ways, and understand, what can we learn from that. Some of you asking, why is it called the middle way? So two ways of thinking about it. I mean, the original understanding coming from the Theravada teachings was that the Buddha was teaching a middle way between the extremes of indulgence and getting caught up in worldly pleasures, and then asceticism or self-mortification. As you may know in his life story, before he reached enlightenment, the first teachers that he followed were very ascetic teachers in the old Indian tradition, where there was a great deal of, starvation and long retreat with, almost like defeating the self by trying to starve it, a little bit like some of the views of medieval Christianity. And he realized that that was not going to bring him to enlightenment, right? That was not the path. And we still hold to that view, but in the Madhyamika, the view is, the middle way view is also understood to mean avoiding extreme views, right? So what's an extreme view? It's eternalism or nihilism. So we'll learn a lot about what these things mean. So eternalism is basically saying something does exist. The self exists, phenomena exist, the sandcastle truly exists. And nihilism is all about, well, nothing exists, nothing matters, who cares? Which I think is sometimes the view that's misunderstood as what the French existentialists were saying. And it's important to understand that when we say middle, middle is not some kind of average between good and bad. It's actually completely transcending these extremes, right? So when we say middle way, yeah, it's not sort of some we do good some days and bad some days and average out our lives. It's learning how do we go beyond all ideas of good and bad in the first place. What does that mean? How might that look? I also want to talk a little bit about the importance of establishing the view for ourselves. In a lot of the teachings in the Pali Suttas, they take this idea of responsibility or personal accountability. So the Buddha said, one is one's own refuge. Who else could be the refuge? And he said, you should do your work, for the Tathagatas only teach the way. Right, so very much, nobody else can liberate us. We have to liberate ourselves. But in so doing, also understanding what is the view that we're relying upon. And here again, there's another famous sutra, the Kalama Sutta, where Buddha said to someone asking, how should we rely on your teachings? He said, do not be led by reports or tradition or hearsay. Do not be led by the authority of religious texts, nor by mere logic or inference, nor by considering appearances, nor by the delight in speculative opinions, nor by seeming possibilities, nor the idea, this is our teacher. But, O Kalamas, when you know for yourselves that certain things are unwholesome and wrong and bad, and give them up, and when you know for yourselves that certain things are wholesome and good, then accept them and follow them. Yeah, so very much the idea here is we're not just sort of approaching this as some kind of instruction, some kind of holy text that we're somehow supposed to follow like some commandments. This is very much something that we're meant to test and then internalize. Another famous saying from the Buddha, do not accept any of my words on faith, believing them just because I said them. Be like an analyst buying gold, who cuts, burns, and critically examines his product for authenticity. Only accept what passes the test by proving useful and beneficial in your life. And there's another teaching called the Four Reliances, which builds on this. So rely on the teaching, not on the person. Rely on the meaning, not on the words. Rely on the definitive meaning, not on the provisional. Rely on your wisdom mind, not on your ordinary mind. So again, this is just another way of saying we really should aspire and work hard to understand and internalize the view for ourselves. Because it's something, when we go through the day-to-day of our life, or even when we're sitting down doing our practice, we can't keep asking our teacher or reading books to find answers. We need to know then and there, in the moment, what are we going to do? Right? And for us to know that, we have to have internalized our view. Right? We need to carry it all the time. It needs to be ours, yeah? Not someone else's view, not something we've heard, not just something we've read or has been taught, but a view that we've internalized. All right, so I really want to encourage you to approach this study and these teachings in that way. But at the same time, the Buddha also said, we can't hang on to these teachings. Yes, we have to internalize them, but they themselves are something we'll let go of. So he talked about this. He said, O bhikkhus, even this view, which is so pure and so clear, if you cling to it, if you fondle it, if you treasure it, if you're attached to it, then you do not understand that the teaching is similar to a raft, which is for crossing over and not for getting hold of. Yeah, so same here, right? We want to approach these teachings as a way to get us to the other side, not so that we can construct some complex philosophy of our own. And indeed, actually, as we go through the text, we'll realize a lot of what the view is telling us is not so much about constructing something new, but about deconstructing our confusion and our wrong views. But even rationality itself, I mean, Rinpoche often talks about journeying from irrational to rational to beyond rational. So yes, we know we don't want to rely on irrational beliefs, confusion, wrong views. And so yes, we use the rationality of this study, this logic, this analysis, to refute and defeat all these confused and wrong views. But that in itself, rationality, that is just another raft, right? Another raft across the river. Because where we're going, as you saw with some of those initial quotes about non-duality, it is beyond rationality. It's beyond thinking. It's beyond speech and conversation and language, right? So yeah, it's a little paradoxical because what we're going to be doing is something that we're going to spend a lot of time building up just at the very end, only to discard it all. Or as Rinpoche put differently, he said, look, yes, the view is essential. Establishing the view, studying it, we need it. It is that foundation. But he said, don't kid yourselves. You're not going to get anywhere just with establishing the view. Most of what you need is practice. 98% of our journey is practice. But as we said before, the practice itself needs to be based on the right view, because otherwise your path won't be leading you in a good direction. And so, really, my aspiration for all of you is that we can learn to internalize the Dharma, right? To go from having an external authority, having all these teachings living outside us, but instead having an inner authority, right? An inner Madhyamaka, an inner non-duality that we can refer to and that we can carry with us all the time. Now, Rinpoche often jokes, he says, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had some simple rules in Buddhism, like in some other religions, like to pray 5 times a day at certain times, or only to wear socks, or never to eat roast potatoes, or something like that. And yes, of course, we can have rules like that, and those rules are indeed easy to follow. But hopefully you can see that that's very, very different from what we're doing here, right? Because our view is much more expansive than that, right? We don't just want a set of rules. We want a foundational understanding of self, more to the point, the non-existence of self, which is then going to guide all of our actions. So that's really my aspiration for you for the next 8 weeks, really to understand the view, to understand how to apply it in your practice, not to give you any new practices, but to give you a new lens perhaps onto your existing practices. And then how to have a sense for what it means for how to live in the world, post-meditation, work, relationships. And really, I guess at an emotional level, how can we make the view, our friend? How can we become really confident in it? Use it as a companion, a guide, a support, something we can really put our trust in. So really, maybe befriending the view is another way I'd like to approach this. And indeed, I would say, a lot of the challenge of how Buddhism may be misunderstood in the West is because people haven't made friends with the view, right? They see it as scary, they see dragons, and, as a result, we hear a lot of teachings which are about walking softly and speaking gently, being mindful, not really based on the view. So thank you. This will appear on the website, and I encourage you to go there for announcements and everything else. And next week we'll be doing the first 5 chapters of the Madhyamaka Avatara. I encourage you to read ahead, and I will see you all next week. Bye.